All right, a lot of you guys that are old school are going to remember that Volkswagens were always straight weight cars. People used to always use a straight 30 or straight 40 weight in your Volkswagen. Today, it's changed a little, and I'm going to kind of go over reasons why that has happened, and maybe this will help you understand this. Want to make sense out of this stuff. This is a 26 millimeter small stud oil pump, and if you see how thick it is, sometimes you can tell by the outside. And this is for a flat cam. So if you have a flat cam engine, if you know it's a flat cam, you may not. You may have a dish cam, and the dish cam 26s were super, super thin. So if you have a late model engine and it's got a really, really thin outside, it might be a 26 millimeter still. So you can't always tell by the outside. How you tell the size of your oil pump is the thickness of the gear. And if you don't have any kind of measuring tool, you can take a wrench and put it on the end of here, and the size of that gear is going to tell you whether you have a 26, a 21, 17, or 30 millimeter or 31. I think they even have that. So in the early days, the 36 horse and the 40 horse, I believe they all had the 17 millimeter oil pump. And the reason they had a 17 millimeter oil pump is because most people were running straight weight oil at that point. And that was a lot of what was over the counter. In fact, they used to use non-detergent back in the early days. Because the early detergent oils were, you had an engine that didn't have an oil filter, and the early detergent oils would kind of water down, I want to say. They were kind of thin, or they'd get hot and they'd thin out, kind of like the Valvoline does now. That's why I don't use Valvoline, guys. I like Castrol, Kendall. Pretty much I stay with those. Some guys are using Pen Grade. I don't really know anything about Pen Grade. I haven't tried it yet, but I've heard that's good too. Not Pennzoil. That's another one. No Pennzoil, no Quaker State. They have a lot of paraffin in them, and they do not work very well with high heat in Volkswagen engines. Again, everything in this video is my opinion. This is how I do it. You can choose to do it however you want. So the death-defying 17 millimeter oil pump that I always take out of the engine became later to the 21 millimeter, and the 21 millimeter had a lot less issues. Most of us today are running 26s or 30s because we're using full flow, 2 coolers, and things like that. The later model dual port engines had 26 millimeter oil pumps, and at that point they started having a lot less issues with oiling on the engines. So again, in the early days, you had the smaller oil pump. Running straight weight was pretty much required because it would give you a little bit more oil pressure. And that was the theory back then that kind of carried on into the 80s even, because there's still those old cars were on the road. They weren't old at that time. They were like 10 or 12, 15 years old. Not like today, we got 40, 50-year-old cars. So again, guys, I run this stuff, GT1 competition. You can do whatever you want. I will run this or Castrol. It depends on if I have this or not. I have to go to a special place to get it. So, yeah. Some guys are actually running today synthetic oil. Now, the issue back in the early days, the early synthetic oils, if you took your rear main seal and you dunked it in the oil for a day, it would swell up like a balloon. That was like the early Mobil 1, okay? Now today I've heard that the formulations have changed. I haven't switched anything to synthetic. In all my other cars, I run 100% synthetic oil in them. The engines last forever pretty much when you do that. I'm not sure how that works on a VW. A lot of guys, you can comment below about that if you're using full synthetic. Some of the synthetics, the ones for diesel engines are better for the VWs if you're going to run a synthetic oil, because the diesel engines have the zinc in them. The zinc that you need for your flat cam, for your tappets and stuff like that. The newer cars have all roller stuff, so a lot of those don't have the zinc in them. So make sure if you're going to use a synthetic that you use one. Like a lot of guys are saying you use Shell Rotella 6, T6. I use that in my pickup truck. Okay, it's very good oil. But then again, I don't use it in my VW. And they have T5, which is a part synthetic. Maybe that would be good if you want to go to the synthetic. The problem with some of the synthetics is they're so thin, and these cars just tend to find leaks. And so if you've got a little bitty leak, when the oil's really cold, it will sometimes just start to find a little place to leak out. And sometimes that's kind of a pain. I don't see any reason other than that that you couldn't run the synthetic today. Because again, the early ones, we put a seal in there or rubber in the oil and it would just swell up and get all weird. That was a long time ago. And, you know, that's why a lot of guys weren't running synthetic in the Volkswagen back then. So again, back to the topic, multi-weight versus straight weight. A lot of your racers like to run straight weight because you can get more oil pressure with that. But the problem in your car, if you're driving it all the time, that straight weight can give you really, really high oil pressure when you first start your engine. Now, with the old 17 millimeter oil pump, it didn't matter because the oil pressure sucked anyway. It didn't have a lot of oil volume, so it was all pressure based. And with the old 17 millimeter oil pump, even the 21s, it was fine to run straight weight oil. But now that most of us are running 26s, you kind of need that low, thinner oil when it's cold. So the multi-weight gives you, 20 weight when it's cold. Some guys are going down to 0 even with the synthetics. And, in the winter, you might even have to run 1040. In the summer, I like to run 2050 because you need that extra 50 weight. I used to run straight 50 back in the old days in my smaller, with the smaller oil pump. Now, here's the issue with too much oil pressure. So if you're running straight 50 in your car in the winter, you see this little guy right here? Let me get you up close. You see this little guy right here on the end of here? They can break off, okay, if you have too much oil pressure. And if you're running like straight 50 in the winter and you fire up your engine, give it any decent amount of RPMs, you could just snap that feller off and lose all your oil pressure, and that's not good. The other thing that can happen is if you're running full flow, you can blow a hose, come off, and, something, because between your pump, okay, it goes through the hose first and comes back, goes through the foot filter and comes back, and then goes into the engine. Usually you have your cooler lines and you've got your oil filter up there, and a lot of guys will blow the gasket out of the oil filter. At the Big Bear show, one of the guys fired up his engine, gave it too many RPMs when it was like 30 degrees out, and blew the gasket out of the oil filter. So this gasket right here just slipped right out of there and all the oil just started leaking all over the ground. So one of the ways to avoid that from happening if you're running more of a high oil pressure engine, so if you got a high RPM engine, is to run the PH1 equivalent, Fram PH1. Back when Fram, I think they were made in America, we used to use them. Now, Wix, I think, is a little better. But any filter is better than what came in the factory car, right? There's nothing. So even running a Fram is better than what came in the car. And some of those, actually, people have seen the insides of those come apart. So yeah, I don't usually run them anymore. I usually run the Wix. But the Fram PH1 equivalent part number has a thicker gasket. So it has more surface area, so it's harder for it to blow out like that. So they can take a lot more oil pressure on that actual oil filter. So like I said, if you're trying to overdo it by putting the really high viscosity oil in, like the 50 weight, straight 50, and you do occasionally fire your engine up when it's cold because you're trying to get that extra oil pressure you can get by running a straight weight, on your race engine, usually that's what you're doing. Street car, absolutely would not put that in the street car at all. I would usually run 2050 or 1040. In the winter time, I'll run 1040, and I'll explain to you why right now. In this 36 horsepower, I have a 26 millimeter oil pump, and when I start this up in the morning, I can hear it sounds kind of like, and it's full flowed, okay, which is pretty rare that you can see that on a 36. Both of those things. A 21 on one of these things would be fine if you didn't have it full flowed but the 26, I put it on there because I got it full flow. I have a external oil filter on it. And when I start this up in the morning, okay, when it's cold, I hear a growl kind of like your power steering pump. If you ever heard that noise, I hear a little growl going on. And what that is that's these gears right here making a little noise trying to push that oil through the passages on that engine. They're very, very small on that engine. And you'll hear this. I've heard this even on my 1904 in my bus, where I hear the growl going on because it's having trouble pushing it through the passages, even with 2050 multi-weight. Now, if I run that straight 50 in that, or straight weight, it's not going to want to thin down as easily as the other one, as the multi-weight is going to do. It's going to be a little bit thicker starting out in the morning. And it'll take a little bit longer to warm the engine up, and I'll have a higher risk of blowing up stuff like the oil filter, blowing the gasket out of it, blowing a line off. That's why you want to run the AN fittings. Then you'll have less chance of that happening. Blow a line off. You could have leaks. My lines are all like 1,000 pounds of pressure, so they're not going to blow up. But some of those cheap ones, you get, maybe they're not that great. Mine are the double braided steel inside, also nylon on the outside lines. So they're rated very high pressure, so that's probably not going to happen. But I'm also worried about that gear in breaking off, and your risks of all those things going up higher are much higher when you're running a single weight oil for the street. And yeah, to get more RPMs, I'll kind of cover that. The more RPMs you run, the more oil pressure you need. So it's the general rule is every 1,000 RPMs, you need 10 pounds of oil pressure. So if you're running 10,000 RPMs, which I would not put 10,000, to do 10,000 RPMs, you have to have a lot of money and parts in your engine. Okay. But if you had a 10,000 RPM engine, then you'd have to have 100 pounds of oil pressure. And that's when you have to get into the crazy stuff, the scavenging pumps and all those things to get that oil pressure up. And that little guy right there might not handle that very easily. And that's why that's for racing only. I don't like to go build an engine for the street that goes over 7. That's a lot of RPMs. You can get a lot of power out of a VW in the 5s and 6s. You don't need to get into the 7,000 RPM range unless you're going to the track, and then you just plan on, taking that motor apart a lot, spending a lot of money on pistons and getting the, like the rods and all that stuff that you need inside the engine, the high horsepower crankshafts, all that stuff. When you start getting those RPMs, the money just starts to flow. So again, because we're typically running bigger oil pumps. A lot of guys are running 30s. I'm running 26s usually because I'm not putting those RPMs in. The guys with the dual carbs, they're getting up in the 6s. And when you're getting up the 6s, you probably need a 30 millimeter oil pump, but I'm not getting there myself. I know guys that run in the 6s that have a 26, and they're usually in the 60, 70 pounds of oil pressure range, and they can do that. But it's a little safer when you have the long lines going up to the oil cooler and coming back. Some guys go to the 30, and either way is fine. It's kind of an opinion thing at that point. And the opinions basically go on things like this. The more oil pressure you have, so if you overpressurize your oil, then the more heat can be created from that. So as you pressurize something, like if you go out to your compressor and your air compressor, you'll notice that the air going out of there is hot. So you touch the outside of the tank, it's hot because it's pressurized. Same thing happens with oil. If you pressurize it too much, it'll get hot, and then it kind of defeats its purpose. So like I said, you know, like I'm running the 26 on there. It's probably too much pump for this, but because again, I got the lines going up to the front and back. One of the things I noticed on this car is I can turn the key, I can start it out, crank it over, start it up for a second, turn the key off, wait like 10 seconds, turn the key back on, the oil light's still off, and I wait about another 5 or so seconds, and then the oil light turns off. That's how much pressure is in that line going up to the oil filter and back, and so much reserves is built up. And it's because it has such small passages inside of it, it takes a long time for that to lose its oil pressure. So that's actually really good. But, you know, again, I'm creating a little extra heat. But again, I take the risk on that, and that's what I'd rather do. And that's again why I like the multi-weight for the street. Okay, and it's because today the thing that's changed is we're running bigger oil pumps than we did. Most of the time when you rebuild your engine, you're running most of the guys are switching to a 26, even on a 40 horse. That's what this engine is under here, and you know, they're going to the 26 millimeter pump because they want to make sure that it can handle the RPMs that we're getting on the freeway now. Back in the old days, when they had 17s in these things, you know, guys weren't running 70, 75 miles an hour on the freeway. It just wasn't happening very often. If you did, with a 437 gear set like what's in this, you know, you're probably going to cook the motor because the old 17, unless you ran maybe 30 straight weight or 40 straight weight or something like that to get the pressure up high enough, you know, you were eventually going to burn that engine up. So a lot of us figured out now, since the engineering changed over the years and got better and better and better, they came up with the 26 millimeter oil pump was the latest version of it. And they figured out that works a lot better to keep the engine to last longer. So a lot of guys have switched over 26s today. And since you switched over to 26, now you've got, you know, a lot of oil pressure when it's cold and less oil pressure when it's hot. So the multi-weight kind of takes care of that and makes less stress on this little thing inside your oil pump that's, you know, stuck in your cam gear. And so, you know, it eliminates some of the issues in my opinion. And that's why today I run multi-weight instead of straight weight in my street car. Okay. If I was doing a race car, be a different situation. I'd go to the straight 50. Okay. Warm it up, take a little while, get it just to get to where it goes through the passages, because I want that oil pressure to be really high at the high RPMs. So that's what you're trying to do, two different things. Okay. And some guys are still stuck on the old straight weight thing for the engines. I mean, if you're running a 17, which again, I would take that sucker out and get rid of it, put a 21 at least in there. If you're running an old 17, then maybe you're right. You should be running the straight weight oil in it. But most of us today aren't. So since we're not doing that, you might want to look at doing multi-weight. All right. So that's the reason I do it. I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.